absolutely thrilled to be able to host this event this evening. My name is Jean-Paul Bayaki. I direct the Urban Democracy Lab here at the Gallatin School. And since we're going to be talking about land and property, I would like to open tonight's event with a land acknowledgement. Many of us here today are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent. We must recognize and never forget that we are occupying the traditional, unceded Lenni Lenape land. Lenape territory includes all of New Jersey, Delaware, eastern Pennsylvania, southeastern New York. But after forced removal and relocation, most descendants of the Lenape currently live in Oklahoma. The Lenape are considered to be one of the oldest tribes in the Northeast, with a history of about at least 10,000 years. In fact, Lenni Lenape means original people. This evening, while we gather on unceded sovereign land of the Lenape, we want to be sure that while we discuss dismantling the systems of oppression, we also recognize our responsibility to educate ourselves about the original stewards of this land. So our event tonight, Beyond Redlining, the Theft of Black-Owned Land and Property Endures, we're going to have a very nice discussion about the centrality of questions of land, property ownership, when we talk about social justice and we think about Black History Month. The Urban Democracy Lab has worked on a number of urban social justice issues over the last 4 years of our existence. And one of the things that we love to talk about, and we love to talk with people about, is the question of land and land ownership. We can't talk about urban democracy without talking about land and racism. And we thought this was a perfect topic for us to bring up on Black History Month. A couple of acknowledgments before we get started with the introductions. So I also want to thank all the people who made tonight's event possible. Jennifer Burge, Angie DeSocio and their team, the theater team, Merv, who's videographing tonight, Daphne Salzer, who did a very nice poster, and Ashanti Smith and Associate Director Becky Amato in the front row for all your good work. This event is part of Gallatin's annual celebration of Black History Month, and we also want to thank the Black History Month Committee for its work on coordinating what really is an awesome amount of great programming. There's the programs on your way out if you haven't picked up also. And while we're on the subject of other events, let me also mention the Urban Democracy Lab is hosting 2 or 3 interesting events coming up. We have one about neighborhoods in Sao Paulo and New York, which will be a day-long symposium on March 12th here at this very theater. And on April 3rd, we're going to have a discussion and screening of the film Recasting Selves with its director, Lalit Vachani, in discussion with our professor, Riddy Lukos. So let me introduce our guests. Vann Newkirk began his career as a policy analyst for the Kaiser Family Foundation, specializing in health policy issues, but was inspired to begin freelance writing after the events in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and has been a staff writer for The Atlantic since 2016. He helped produce this very nice special commemorative issue of the magazine in 2018 on MLK Jr.'s legacy on the 50 years of his assassination. Newkirk also founded as a contributing editor to 7 Scribes, a website dedicated to promoting writer and artists of color. And as of 2019, he has a very nice project, which is long-form podcast exploring the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which he will host. He graduated from Morehouse College in 2010 and UNC Chapel Hill in 2012, and he's going to be working on a deadline tonight, so we especially appreciate you coming to be with us. Travis Hill is a unit chief in the Criminal Division of New York State Office of the Attorney General and a former assistant U.S. attorney and assistant district attorney. He has extensive experience in complex investigations, trials, and appellate litigation, and has managed teams of attorneys, investigators, auditors, and paralegals in cases involving public corruption, embezzlement, complex frauds, money laundering, mortgage fraud, and healthcare fraud. And I can't think of a more honorable profession these days. He has indicted and tried cases in multiple counties in New York State as well in the District of Columbia, and has handled criminal appeals in both New York and DC, all resulting in the permanence of conviction. Currently, and the reason he is particularly here tonight, he's chief of the real estate unit of the New York State Attorney General's office. Thank you for being with us. Stacey Sutton will be walking in. Stacey Sutton is kind of like Schrodinger's cat. She may or may not be here, owing to the weather, but she's trying very hard to be with us. I guess Schrodinger's cat had no agency. But Stacey Sutton is assistant professor of urban planning policy at the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC Chicago. Her excellent work focuses on worker cooperatives, economic democracies, equitable development, and racially disparate effects of place-based policy and planning. She has a forthcoming study titled Cooperative Cities. She also examines how municipal leaders are creating and enabling environments for starting and planning and sustaining worker-owned cooperatives and limitations of the local state. Other bodies of her work focus on punitive cities, meaning the disparate impact of urban policy and place-based initiatives. Finally, Stacey examines interplay among race, gentrification, and neighborhood change. And this is the premise of a book she's working on called Buy Black, Race, Retail, and the Politics of Neighborhood Business Survival. And finally, my colleague, Kimberly Johnson, who I learned tonight is doing the immense sacrifice of leaving her semester of luxurious sabbatical to be with us. So thank you, Kimberly. We owe you. She has been professor of social and cultural analysis and an affiliate member of the Wagner School here at NYU. Her research focuses on American and urban political development, urban and local politics, race and ethnic politics. She's the author of 2 books, Reforming Jim Crow from 2010 and Governing the American State from 2007, as well as numerous articles on American political development and its intersection with racial and ethnic politics. Her current research projects focus on African American urban and suburban politics. And she's completing a book entitled Dark Concrete, exploring the development of black power urbanism in Newark and East Orange, New Jersey, and in Oakland and East Palo Alto in California. So welcome all, and let's get started.
Thank you.
I'll talk first and then hopefully set you up.
That sounds good.
Okay. This is really exciting for me to be here with 2, hopefully 3 really great speakers. This, I think, is at a particularly interesting moment given recent discussions in the news about redlining and the effects thereof, whether they were good or bad. And unfortunately, we are in a spatial location in which the author of those comments on redlining has funded our space that we are in. So this is kind of another kind of land acknowledgement in a way, not to denigrate land acknowledgements. So as I was thinking about how to introduce the members of the panel, I did a very curious thing, and I have to acknowledge Kevin Brunel, who is a scholar of Indigenous studies at Babson College, and he brought up a very great recognition of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. And so I just want to read a little bit from his chapter on Counterrevolution of Property, and then just bring in a teeny bit of my own work as a way of hopefully setting up our 2 speakers to talk about the issues that we're going to be talking about today, which is the issue of land, right? Of possession and dispossession, of the right to stay, as well as the right to leave, right? And how does that impact lives of Black Americans, both in the past, but also today? So in this chapter on the Counter-Revolution of Property, he talks about the founding of the Freedmen's Bureau, and in particularly the Freedmen's Bank. Lincoln, when signing the law, said, "This bank is just what freedmen need," at the time that he signed the bill. The incorporators and trustees of the bank included Peter Cooper Village, if you've ever been there, William Cullen Bryant, A.A. Lowe, Garrett Smith, John Jay, S.G. Howe, George L. Stearns, Edward Atkinson, and Chief Justice Chase. The business was confined to the Negro race, and at least 2/3 of the deposits must be invested in United States securities. The deposits came from day laborers, house servants, farmers, mechanics, washerwomen, and the proverbial thriftlessness of the Negro seemed about to be disproven. North as well as South, the whites were agreeably surprised. So the bank is put into place. Everything's kind of more or less going well. The assets were amply protected by provisions requiring investment mainly in government bonds. However, this is my addition, this is Du Bois, an amendment to the charter was introduced into Congress in 1870, which provided that one half of the deposits invested in United States bonds might be invested in other notes and bonds secured by real estate mortgages. Immediately, the pennies of poor black laborers were replaced by worthless notes. Money was loaned recklessly to the speculators in the District of Columbia. J. Cook and Company, the great bankers, borrowed $500,000, and this company and the First National Bank of Washington controlled the Freedmen's Bank between 1870 and 1873. Runs were started on the bank, and then an effort was made to unload the whole thing on Frederick Douglass as a representative Negro. This was useless, and the bank finally closed in June 1874. The Commission of Three, which liquidated the Freedmen's Savings Bank, paid depositors 30% and charged for their services $318,753. At the date of closing, so far as known, there was due to depositors $2,993,790.68 in 61,144 accounts. This was never paid. The assets amounted to $32 million. The rest was represented by personal loans and loans in real estate, which were practically uncollectible. The total business transacted by the Freedmen's Bank was extraordinary, considering that the bulk of its clientele had just emerged from slavery. Its total deposits at one time reached $57 million. Thus, the most promising effort to raise the financial status of the best and thriftiest of Negroes went down in the maelstrom of national corruption. It is difficult to overestimate the psychological effect of this failure upon Negro thrift. But after all, the amount of cash handled by the freedman was small, and by far the most pressing of his problems as a worker was that of land. This land hunger, this absolutely fundamental and essential thing to any real emancipation of the slaves, was continually pushed by all emancipated Negroes and their representatives in every southern state. It was met by ridicule, by anger, and by dishonest and insincere efforts to satisfy it apparently. I'm going to jump in time to 2013. In 2013, only 4 Afro-Americans or Afro-American households in Oakland received mortgages from America's top 12 banks. 4. To be sure, there are a lot of caveats and explanatory factors that could account for this. But if we think about Oakland as kind of the city of black power, how is it that in 2013, in a city that is still 28% African American, it was more, now there's less, how is it that only 4 African American households received mortgages? In 2019, 28% of the mortgages in Newark, New Jersey, the other side of my research, were underwater. And in 2010, Newark had probably one of the highest, top 10, maybe even top 5, mortgage foreclosure rates in the United States. And so I think the question that we're here today to talk about is beyond redlining. It is about the right to stay, the right to leave. It is about the ability to create not only places for people to live, but also, and not just to survive, but also to thrive. And so how can we think about and talk about what has happened in the past, but also point ourselves to what can possibly happen in the future? So I'm going to leave it up to our 2 speakers, and hopefully Stacey, to really help us think through what does it mean when we think about beyond redlining. All right.
Okay, actually, yeah, I think I'll sit. It's been a long day. I mean, if we're talking about counter-revolution of property, we're going to be really jamming in here. And so I'm excited. I think that's actually an amazing way to segue into sort of, I believe why I'm here and what I've been researching and reporting on for the last couple of years. Du Bois talks about that land hunger, which is both a material thing in a country where our economic system essentially dictates that wealth determines your ability to self-determine, your total trajectory. Property, land, is a primary form of building that wealth. And so I think the enslaved folks, formerly enslaved folks during Reconstruction, were pretty clear-eyed about the fact that the only way they were going to be able to make good on any of the promises of freedom was to have land and to have wealth, to build wealth. So I wrote the cover story for The Atlantic in September on land hunger and on its ramifications, on how it was beaten back over several generations, and what the revolutions and counter-revolutions in property meant for the total trajectory of black folks in the U.S. So I followed in the Mississippi Delta, I followed black farmers who had been there. The Scott family I followed, the patriarch of the Scott family got there just after Reconstruction from Alabama. And people went to the Delta. Back then it was wilderness still, almost. And people went to the Delta in hopes, black folks went in hopes of owning land. And actually the Mississippi Delta had the highest rates of black land ownership in the country. There were more black landowners in 1910 than there were white landowners. Obviously Mississippi was like 80% black, but it was for a time a place where a dream of the black yeoman farmer who could be self-reliant, who could be independent, who could live what they were taught was the American dream. That was what Mississippi was to those folks. And so the Scott family moves out there, and through almost superhuman force of will and intellect, they began to, even against the maintenance of Jim Crow, which endeavored to keep black folks from acquiring land, they managed to get an acre, 50 acres, 100 acres, 1,000 acres. They managed to become farmers at the kind of scale that you need to become in order to grow cotton, in order to be successful as a cotton or soybean farmer. And over most of the 20th century, the Scott family is growing their holdings. They're becoming people who are demanding respect in the counties in the Delta, despite being black and that being looked down upon. They're weathering all the different, the Great Depression, the farming crises, the introduction of federal credit mechanisms that completely changed agriculture in this country. And they did it with the very same kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality and work that black folks have always been told since Reconstruction, and that black folks themselves have been, I think, the strongest proponents of in that region. And they did it when they're Ed Scott Sr., when the local authorities refused to build them a water pipeline because they just didn't have a local need for black people to have municipal water. Ed Scott Sr. built the water pipeline himself with his own hands. And that's the kind of work that they cherished. We get to the 1950s with this family, and we have the entirety of American agriculture has changed. The foundations of agribusiness, as we know it, of big farming, of big corporate farming begin, and they really begin in the Mississippi Delta. It's the most fertile farmland we have in the country. And what that means for black farmers is you can't really compete against a farmer that can put 10,000 acres at scale, that can buy the crop dusters that they have, that can afford not only to get what we were starting with, the Roundup and the biologically engineered crops at the time. They could afford to keep black folks out of the market, and then they could afford to push them into sharecropping. And one of the ways they did that was by using the leverage of the federal government. The federal government administered its programs through locally elected committees. If you know anything about the South in the 1950s, is that black people were not involved in local elections. So I trace how essentially with not just the aid of the federal government, with the guidance and the direct interjection of the federal government, the place that once was almost a utopia for black land ownership has, over the course of really only a generation span, gone from 1 million acres of land owned just about to almost nothing. And it's through these locally elected committees that give out loans and denied loans to black farmers who didn't meet their didn't meet their credit requirements, didn't have the leverage they needed, who, maybe we're going to require you to go and lease a tractor from the John Deere guy up the street, and he's a Klansman. So, just kind of almost comically ridiculous gauntlets these black folks had to go through. And I follow this family as they go through this period, as they make it through that, and they finally get up to the biggest farm inflation crisis that we have, which is the 1980s stagflation crisis, which puts more American farmers out of business than anything since the Great Depression. And they finally decide they'd gone a century of family farming without taking federal loans, without taking federal assistance. And they said, we need it. The guy goes to the local agent, Ed Scott Jr. goes to the local agent and gets the loan 1 year. The next year he comes back and the agent is upset because he's driving a new truck. And around the same time, as agriculture was failing, the U.S. government starts getting into propping up catfish farming. If you ever had catfish in the last couple years, it's likely, if it's grown domestically, it's grown in Mississippi. And the only reason we have catfish that we sell in the stores is because USDA started subsidizing catfish farming to save white farmers in Mississippi, not black farmers. And so this guy wants to get into catfish farming. Long story short, he is denied that opportunity. He becomes one of the main plaintiffs in the black farmers lawsuit, which is still to this day maybe the only time we've gotten this sort of reparations for black folks in any sort of form. Lots of black farmers were engaged in a class action lawsuit against the USDA for discrimination of this sort, and they got a couple $1 billion from the federal government, which rounds out to about $14,000 per farmer. If you know anything about farming, that's about enough to get you one tire on one of those big combines. So it wasn't a whole lot. Like you can easily get about $1 million in loans for one season of growing alone. So $14,000. Yeah. Still, I traced this family through all this, through not just the sort of ins and outs of the legal process, but what the land meant to them. And it was part of that land hunger, part of their desire to have something of their own in our capitalist country, to have something that defines your worth as a person, and to have something that can basically ground their political advocacy, because as we know, land is the basis for political strength in this country. Now, this is a forum on beyond redlining, and I'm certain we'll talk a lot about the urban forms of land theft, of land loss, of dispossession. But I'm grateful that we started this with a land acknowledgement. So I think it helps us understand that, number one, there's nothing new under the sun. And it helps us connect all these, I'm sure we'll talk about it, all the mechanisms of exploitation, of dispossession in the city, all these advanced modes of gentrification, of all the predatory things that happened during the Great Recession and beyond, how they are connected to a history of dispossession, of exploitation that began with the exploitation, the murder, the movement of indigenous folks. And so, to acknowledge in my own piece, it started on Choctaw land in Mississippi. And so I think it's important, although my piece is a rural piece, to note that the basic dynamics of people striving to have something in a system where wealth defines you, to have something to build wealth, and to have that taken from, not just taken from them, but to have it taken and used against them. That is the same story that we're talking about today in the cities. And it's one that I believe, especially in your work, we're realizing now has been the story of the last 10 years or so, last decade or so in America since the Great Recession. And we're finally kind of uncovering some of the long-term effects of that now. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Thank you. Can you go next?
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for moderating. Vann, thank you for joining me on this panel. Becky, thank you for setting this up. And NYU, thank you for hosting us. Before I get started, I do have to give a disclaimer. Although I am a senior official at the New York State Attorney General's office, I'm here this evening in my personal capacity. What I share with you is not necessarily the thoughts of the New York State Attorney General's office, not necessarily the thoughts of Attorney General Tish James, and not necessarily the thoughts of the state of New York and the governor of New York. That being said, I'm here to speak with you about what's going on in present-day New York City and what's going on the ground in terms of the theft of property and the theft of land and how that's impacted by gentrification and the changes that we've seen in the city in the past 15, 20 years. But before I jump into the details of that, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about how I came to focus on real estate crimes and deed theft and tenant harassment and other types of crimes that affect home ownership here in New York City. So as my background was shared by Gianpaolo, I'm a career government servant and a career prosecutor. And in 2015, I was working as a special assistant attorney general prosecuting corruption cases here in New York State. And I had no experience whatsoever in real estate and had no thought that I would be getting involved in real estate and homeowner issues in New York City in a major way. That being said, the state AG's office started getting a number of complaints about a New York City landlord. And the AG's office decided to put together a special group of prosecutors, both civil and criminal attorneys. And I was one of the criminal attorneys that was chosen to work on that particular case. And we ended up prosecuting that landlord for mortgage fraud, for bank fraud, for tax fraud, and he was sued by the AG's office for tenant harassment. And a reparations fund was set up for the tenants of his buildings in the Lower East Side and the East Village. And so I came to working on real estate cases as any well-planning professional does. I did so by accident. But being a Baptist from Virginia, I would say it was divine intervention. And seeing that case and the impact that it had on those tenants in the buildings where the landlord owned and how he was treating those tenants and how it impacted their day-to-day lives and their ability to have a safe place to live, to raise their families, to feel like they had a secure community to be a part of, really drew me to continue working on real estate cases. So a few years later, I became the chief of the real estate unit, and I'm still the chief of that unit to this day. Our primary focus in regards to what we're discussing here tonight are crimes that revolve around two aspects of home ownership. One is deed theft. And so that's become very, very prevalent here in New York City, especially in heavily gentrifying neighborhoods, certain parts of Brooklyn, as I'm sure you're well aware, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, Flatbush, and then Harlem here in Manhattan are probably the leading neighborhoods when it comes to gentrification, as well as areas in Southeast Queens. And the economic drivers are making it so that a lot of not only regular real estate players, but bad actors are very interested in capitalizing on the economic benefits and the money that's now flowing through these neighborhoods. And the most money that can be made is through real estate. And so deed theft, surprisingly, and I did not know this prior to working on real estate crimes, is a very, very easy crime to commit. It's easier to steal the deed to a property in New York State than it is to burglarize a home. In New York City, there are certain forms that you have to file in order to transfer a deed from one person to another person or to an unknown entity such as an LLC or a corporation. And as long as you file those particular documents with the city, along with a deed transfer that's notarized, you will be the recognized owner of that property. And so it's that simple. Someone can go online, see the documents that they need to file with the city. There's 12 or 13 documents that are required. They can go online, look up a stock deed transfer. They can forge a signature. You don't even have to trick someone into signing over the deed to their property. You can forge a signature, have it notarized. It can be a fake notary, and file that with the city. And based on the filing of that document, as long as everything's accurate on its face, you are now the legitimate owner of that property. So that's how simple it is to transfer property here in New York City illegally. So another thing that's a major issue that we're running into are loan modification scams. So a lot of individuals who are now in these gentrifying neighborhoods, they're facing the economic squeeze. You know, it can be rising property tax rates. It can be the cost of maintaining their property that they may have purchased for $70,000, $80,000 back in the 80s and is now worth $1.5, $2 million, and they're not able to maintain that. So now they're facing economic hardship. They're possibly facing foreclosure. They're possibly going through foreclosure. A lot of bad actors are approaching these individuals and saying that they have a quick fix. There's a way for them to help them get out from under foreclosure and to keep their home. And in reality, they're just tricking them out of their home. And a lot of times, they're also getting payments along the way. So not only are you getting the home from someone that they've owned for decades through the bad times and the good, you're also getting monthly payments on top of that for a service that you're not even providing. So that's another major scam that we're seeing on the deed theft front. Another aspect that we pay close attention to and that we're prosecuting at the Attorney General's office is what's known as tenant harassment. Now, I know this is about home ownership, but I think in New York City it's very important to talk about tenants and their rights here in the city of New York and the state of New York, because New York City is a renter city. 2/3 of the people in New York City rent. That means that only 1/3 of people own their homes in New York City. And for African Americans, it's even lower. It's only 24 25% home ownership rate for African Americans in New York City. That means that most people view their rental apartment as their home, as their permanent living space. My wife is a New York City resident. She's a native of New York City. She's lived her entire life. Her parents still live here. They still live in the apartment where she grew up. It's rent stabilized. They've been there for 30, 40 years, and they're not going anywhere. That's their home. So I think it's important for us to think of home ownership broadly when we talk about New York City, and to also include tenants and under that umbrella. And on that front, they're also feeling the squeeze in gentrifying neighborhoods, because a tenant who's been in an apartment for 30 years in a gentrifying neighborhood may be paying a $900, $1,000 rent on an apartment that can go market rate for $3,000. So there's owners that want to get that person out. And so that leads us to tenant harassment. That leads us to unlawful eviction. And so owners are taking lots of illegal steps, such as constant construction, tearing down all the walls, turning off the utilities and keeping them off, not having heat for months and months and months in the winter, all for the purpose of evicting rent-stabilized long-term tenants, many of them who are black and brown, and getting them out so that you can get market rate tenants in and get more money. So there's definitely an economic driver behind all of this. There's definitely bad actors who are trying to capitalize on that, and it's something that needs to be brought to the forefront. And so I think it's important to make that a part of the discussion. And so again, I'm thankful for you having me here tonight to discuss these issues.
All right, so I think this is so important to have this discussion about the mechanisms, because it's, I hate to say this phrase, but the devil is in the details, right? That if we think about the ways in which the right to stay, whether we're talking about home ownership or tenancy, tenure of place, is so key to not only what I would call, and others like e-viewing would call, shared institutions, right? Where you live is linked to your educational opportunities. It's linked to access to jobs. And more importantly, it's linked to political representation. So even if we go beyond sort of Jim Crow South, where you live, can you live in a place and be able to vote, is an important thing. And so I think that's an important something for us to kind of keep in mind. I think one of the things that Becky and I were talking about as we thought about, what are the kind of questions that we'd like to ask you or have you sort of think about, is if you could just sort of think about, here are three things, right? The ability to stay, and I guess what does that mean in a society in which constant movement, social mobility is almost premised on leaving, right? And even to think about, the fact that we do land acknowledgements is because American-style capitalism, in some ways, is based on the expropriation of property in this constant sort of movement and expansion and expropriation.
In all ways.
What's that?
In all ways.
In all ways. So what does it mean to stay, right? What are the sort of political and economic implications of that? Second, I think we wanted to think about, maybe broken up this later, about resistance, right? What are some short-term as well as long-term strategies that we can think about to give people the right to stay, right? Or to give people the security of tenure. I think the third thing is also to think about the variety of solutions that are out there. Certainly reparations is kind of in the air, but what do we mean by reparations? I mean, some have argued that we should have reparations for people who lived in formerly redlined areas. Again, the mechanisms, but then what does that mean? I think secondly, under sort of solutions, another idea has been the idea of decommodification. So how do we decommodify at least housing? How do we sort of enable the sort of right to live and the right to stay to be delinked from wealth accumulation, right? And I think this is something where Kianga Yamada-Taylor's recent work on redlining is really important for us to think about what does it mean to be included, but actually included on this unequal basis, particularly what her phrasing of it as predatory inclusion. What does that mean? Or is there something else? I mean, how can we sort of broaden the conversation or the possibilities, if you will, to think about how do we give people, especially Black folks, the ability to stay and to thrive? And I think, and maybe this is probably more of a tricky question for you. I'm sorry, you, Travis, sorry, not you. Can the system work for the people? Or do we need to think of a new alternative? So a lot of really broad questions. Dive into wherever you feel most comfortable, but I think that this is particularly given one of the current frontrunners of the Democratic primaries comments on redlining, this is a great place and space to have this conversation. I'm talking about Bloomberg. Sorry.
It's interesting. If we let's start with Bloomberg as our peg, because for me, it's the central question of aside from the current incumbent, of the things that people are deciding about in this primary and this election is actually the issue of inequality, right? And I think you see sort of a underlying all the differences in the progressive wing, the moderate, the conservative centrist wings of Democrats is a disagreement over the mechanism, right? And some people, you have much more damning critiques of the actual system itself in some candidates, and you have some people who think you can do some reforms kind of around the edges, or you have some people who think that redlining is good. So, one. And so your question really gets to what we as voters are deciding in the moment. It's kind of exciting as a journalist who's followed all this stuff for years now. You don't get to see that many times in American history when people are deciding on something that important and broad. And so that's for me as an observer, just a fascinating thing. Regarding the right to stay, and I think the linked question was whether that can be preserved under the current system, kind of? Was that where you were?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The right to stay is something that really, I don't know if you can say we have it in our current system, right? It doesn't exist. In a system where you can be legally or unlawfully exploited out of your the land you own, in a system where the land you own is inherently valuable in a way that is going to incentivize people to exploit you off of that. Even in cases of tenancy in places like New York, where there is a finite and squeezed market of real estate, like I don't see I don't see a way to think about the right to stay as a right as established in our current laws yet. And so I think by nature, the question would involve of preserving that, would involve creating that. And that means changing the system. That means, I think a lot about things like community land trusts, which if you don't know them, essentially it's a co-op system where people can get together and spare you all the weird, this may be a good place for details, but one of the defining features of it is if you sell, the amount you can get back in equity is capped. So essentially doesn't destroy the incentive for selling a house to make money off of it, because one of the main mechanisms of it is to get low-income folks as sort of a springboard into from their starter home to that's how it's operated in most places now. But it does essentially, in the aggregate, cap the ability of, say, speculators, of big developers, of people from the outside to make money off the equity that people's real estate gains. And you see a pretty strong community land trust movement in places like Oakland, in lots of cities. It actually started in Georgia right after the Civil Rights Movement, and it's a rural concept. It's basically the concept of co-op farms applied to urban real estate as we envision it today. So I could see a future in which a city essentially becomes a community land trust. And as they grow, eventually, if they grow enough, we all will live in one, and the system will have changed. And so I think I look at that as one of the main pieces on the frontier we're looking out to, where there is lots of movement, where people who are and have been disaffected by recent trends in land ownership and recent inability to see lots of people have sort of become disenchanted with the idea of home equity itself after the Great Recession, and people who came out losers or underwater, and people who have been kind of, the word I'm looking for, screwed by the current system. There are lots of takers for this model now, and I think that's something to look for.
Yeah. Just to kind of follow up on that, talking about the right to stay and community land trust, I think inherent in the right to stay is this kind of overarching idea of community. Being able to put down roots somewhere to build not only within your own family, but within the community at large, a sense of pride in your surroundings and in the area and in your own land and home and in your neighbor's land and home. And when you have all these economic pressures and all of these members of the kind of the capitalist system who are acting to capitalize on the money that's a result of the changes in certain communities, then it takes away from that sense of community. And it takes away from that feeling that someone can stay, or someone has the right to stay, or to leave if they choose. And that takes me kind of to my second point on this issue, is that when you think about the right to stay, I think it comes down to an absolute freedom of choice. And under the current system, most people don't have that. You know, even if you're in a place where you're happy now, and let's say you're in a rent-stabilized apartment in New York City, you hear this from people all the time. If I left here, where would I go? If I left here, there's nowhere else in the same neighborhood that I would be able to get an apartment, even though this is a studio that I lived in when I was single 30, 40 years ago, and now I'm married and I have a family. I'm not leaving this because there's no way that I would ever be able to afford to live in the same community, in the same neighborhood. So until we get to a place where we can have absolute freedom of choice, I don't think you can really be in a place where people can say, they have the right to stay. They really feel like they have the right to stay.
Right. So the right to stay is the right to move.
Right.
Oh yeah, it's the ability to do both freely and not exploited, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let me just I want to go back a little bit to the farmers, because I wrote an article about this, which is the role of the federal government. And I think what's so interesting so the federal government essentially creates a two-tier welfare system. I call it the agricultural welfare system, one for whites and one for blacks. And it's very much segregated and affords opportunities to whites and not to blacks. And then around the 1930s, 1940s, they shift to essentially supporting corporate agriculture, and African Americans are essentially shut out from this. What I find really fascinating is if you could talk a little bit about is the Pigford case, and the amount of just ridicule and scorn. I mean, to go back to Du Bois's words, that African American farmers actually had a legitimate claim to damages, and that in fact the USDA was actually forced to acknowledge this.
Yeah. So that two-tier welfare system thing is always my hobby horse, because I mean, everything we call welfare, for the most part, 90% of all welfare money in this country is in one bill, right? It's a farm bill. It's and you think of welfare as the food stamp SNAP program, but really most welfare is the subsidies we give to farmers, to big farmers, in the very same bill as SNAP benefits. And now people get all out of shape about who gets SNAP and how much we spend on it and cutting it. But to segue to the second part of the question about Pigford, which ended up being a $2 billion total settlement, that's like rounding error for the amount of subsidies we give out and the amount that people get back in lawsuits for problems with the subsidy program, or for the amount people pour into lobbying for the subsidies for sugar, for corn, for soybeans now. And so you think about like the scale of this is always my thing. I talked about the $14,000 per farmer before, but the scale of a lawsuit that has been characterized as the first federal payment of reparations to black folks in this country since Sherman gave out Field Order 15, 40 acres and a mule, $2 billion, which is a couple of F-35 airplanes, right? But that lawsuit, for the background for it, in 1999, a bunch of black farmers and advocates joined in a class action lawsuit for discrimination over, not the entirety of discrimination, but discrimination over a certain period in the 80s, during Reagan and beyond, when the Civil Rights Division of the USDA was effectively dismantled. And so they had an actionable case, which was all these reports of discrimination were essentially didn't go anywhere because they had no office. And so the administration acted against the 14th Amendment. The judge basically ruled that people who had both provable claims of discrimination during this time and people who had sort of had like the kind of disparate impact claims could get some amount of money from the federal government over different tracks. Again, $14,000 per person. Most farmers got less. A couple farmers were really skewed because they got like big settlements. So if you take away the $1 million earners, most farmers got below $5,000 from the settlement. Now, I don't know if you remember during the Obama administration. You obviously remember this, but Shirley Sherrod, right? And during the Obama administration, one of the employees at USDA, she's also the founder of that first community land trust that I talked about. She had basically advocated for other black farmers in Georgia to get in on the lawsuit just prove they had claims or whatever. And Breitbart News edited a video to make it look like she was saying the U.S. government was racist. Back then, different time. Different time. It cost her job. She was fired by the administration, and it was a big thing. And the underlying current there was that these black people are getting reparations. Obama is a president giving out reparations, the black president giving out reparations to black people. And it was a big scandal that these black folks were getting $5,000 for being screwed out of millions of dollars by the federal government in a documented way. And that fact has always stuck with me as something so remarkable and telling about just where we are. I think we are having really progressive conversations about the system, but I think when it comes down to the brass tacks of it, like, we are still talking about a system where not a whole lot of show me being done in it. Haven't been any substantial movements to get, to rectify, to go back in time and solve the problems that are perpetuated today. Most of those farmers were elderly. We haven't done much to solve the problem for their children who may have had to leave, their grandchildren who don't have anything. What's $5,000 to $14,000 get you in that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think just in general, the idea of reparations, there's not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to be able to pay enough reparations to the people, the black and brown people who have been harmed throughout the history of the United States and their descendants, to make people whole. So it's a matter of how do we move forward from here, and what's the next step in terms of changes we can make to make it so that the next generation can be better off than the last. But to go back to your overarching question about the system, does the system, is there a way to make the current system work in which within the framework that we have? The system, whether it's the federal government, the state government, or the New York City government, was built for a specific purpose, and that was to maintain power for a particular subset of individuals and corporations and entities. It was not so that the people, we the people as a whole, collectively, can all have equal rights, equal say, and equal right to stay in your property. The system was never intended to work that way. So does the system work? It works perfectly fine for what it was intended to do,
Right.
But it doesn't work for the general mass of the public and for the collective well-being. So I think there's more fundamental questions about how we should be structuring the system and what changes should be made going forward. And that gets back to, you take a step back to the importance of being involved politically, being involved with your elected officials, being involved on the city, the state, and the federal level, because these are your decision makers. And if you think that it doesn't make a difference, you just look here in New York and the changes that have occurred in the last couple of years, just because you've had a unified Democratic legislature. Last year, there were new laws added for tenant protections that have made it much more difficult for landlords to abuse rent-stabilized tenants and to ultimately remove them from their homes. So those sort of things do make a difference, but the laws need to be changed, and if the laws are going to be changed and changed in a way that benefit more people and help more minorities in terms of how they're treated, whether or not they can benefit from the economy, whether or not they can own homes or stay in their rentals, then you have to be politically active. You have to be involved with your representation and make sure that they're representing you in the way that they should be. And if they're not, you vote them out and you move on to someone else.
Good. We'll do some Q&A. Okay, so this has been, I think, a really great conversation. More to be said on this, but I think maybe at this point, maybe we'll just do some Q&A. So what I'd like to ask and really emphasize is that lots of people have lots of things to say, but if you keep it to questions rather than comments, we'd really appreciate that. Again, people have things to say, but I really want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask a question of our two really great speakers. So if you could just, say your name or not, and just really be kind of brief and succinct in your questions. That would be really great. We'd really appreciate it. So we'll start from, I guess, front to back.
Thank you, all of you, for your comments today. My name is Millery Pollinay, Associate Dean here at the Gallatin School. Travis?
Yes.
I really need you to speak as someone who is part of the AG's office at this moment in terms of what is Letitia
Depends on what your
James.
question is going to be.
What is Letitia James's office, the AG's office, doing in terms of deed theft? I need to know what are the moves, as much as you can tell me.
Sure. So I can give you some factual background on what the office is doing, but I won't speak in terms of her personal opinions and what she wants to do personally in terms of that issue here in New York State. So I can tell you that it is a major priority for the AG's office right now. We've convened a task force across New York City, engaging with the various DA's offices as well as other agencies that are involved in investigating and prosecuting deed theft. We're reaching out to affected communities. We had a outreach door knock campaign in Brooklyn last month. That was in Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, and I believe it was part of East Flatbush. We're doing some more community outreach events as well. And we're also, because I think one major portion of helping to prevent deed theft is education. Now, I heard a lot of visceral response from the audience when I told you just how simple it is to transfer a deed here in New York City and change the name of who owns a property. And so part of it is education and outreach, and so we're definitely engaged in that. And the other part is enforcement. And so I won't get into the details of our enforcement actions because I'd never want to tip off the bad actors, but we are definitely stepping up our enforcement on that front, and we're targeting a number of, we're prosecuting individual actors and individual acts of deed theft, but we're also looking at large-scale players as well. So we're looking at taking out the major players that are impacting multiple communities around the city and are doing this repeatedly as part of their business model, because they're the ones who are really damaging New York City and their neighborhoods.
Can I just ask a quick question? I know I'm like just horrified by this. So those who have been victims, is there any sort of recourse to get it back?
So it's problematic because there's the crime of deed theft, which we prosecute, and then in terms of getting the home back, unfortunately, you have to go through the civil process, or you have to let the criminal process play out. And there is now, also part of new legislation, a mechanism at the conclusion of a criminal prosecution involving deed theft where we can petition the court to have the homeowner's property returned to them. So it is a lengthy process, and that's one of the things that we're trying to work on to get a legislative fix, because homeowners want their property back. Family members who received property as inheritance, they want that property, whether they want to keep it or sell it and move on. They want access to that, and once it's been stolen, it can be tied up in the courts for a very long time, which is problematic.
Thanks.
Wow.
Anyone else?
That is terrifying.
Hi, thank you guys so much for your time. I also wonder what the placement of like active culture and active community engagement would be in also how the impetus of development and like new bigger land developers coming into a space, right? Like the social impetus and the financial impetus of like a transient population, right? So I don't think it's a mistake that Harlem has Columbia. A lot of the like hypersensitive communities in Brooklyn are a very short train ride from NYU, and you are talking to a predominantly white college population. So like, what is the acknowledgement or the understanding of transplants and participants in transient rental communities that kind of open the gate for developers and don't actually pay into the financial or the social communal benefits of a given borough?
Forgive me, I'm going to actually jump on top of that question because that's a really great question, which is to sort of broaden it and ask about the role of institutional real estate investors, particularly the ones who have gone into communities like Oakland, where there have been whole neighborhoods that have had lots of foreclosures and have turned those foreclosed homes of African-American owners into actual rental properties. In some parts of the neighborhoods and in more sort of desirable parts of these neighborhoods, they've actually flipped them into basically they've gentrified. I just want to add that I think it's Huey Newton's old house in Oakland was actually bought through foreclosure and flipped. So there you go. The past is not even past.
Well, I think you just answered it, huh?
Sorry.
Well, I think for a long time, we've operated under a basic paradigm in cities of the theory of the anchor institution, right? Mm-hmm. And the anchor institution is supposed to be, it's a social good. It provides way for, it's like the model basically postulates that institutions like universities, like public schools, like big libraries, hospitals, essentially put roots down in a community and keep certain services and goods there longer than they normally would be, which is true to a point. But also, I think what we've really learned over the past couple decades is that they also serve as repulsive factors, as accelerators in gentrification, especially in places where the rings of gentrification are already close to the university, where you have homes that were affected by the foreclosure crisis. They have been extraordinarily, let's see, what's the value neutral term here? Transformative in the shape of our cities. My familiarity is mostly with Atlanta, and it is sadly a thing that even historically black colleges and universities engage in. I went to Morehouse, as it was said in the bio, and the Atlanta University Center, which is the universities including Morehouse Spelman, Clark Atlanta, Morris Brown, and the Theological Center. The area around them now has increased dramatically in value, and a series of universities with a stated commitment to black wealth and future prosperity has not been all that helpful in preserving the historically black neighborhood around the universities. And now we got a great new dome where the Falcons play right down the street, and things are not looking up.
You want to say anything about
I think you raise a very interesting and complex question. I think about it first from a personal standpoint. I'm not a New York City native. I moved here from Virginia. I'm a young professional. I happen to be black, but am I a gentrifier? Some people may say that I am. And if my skin was a different color, most people would definitely say that I am. But New York's home now, and I put down roots. My wife is a native. We have a family. We're going to stay here long term, and we're committed to the community in which we live. That being said, it becomes very difficult and very complex because you're almost the people who are moving in and want to now live in these neighborhoods. They're driving kind of the new economic boom and the reason why some of these bad actors are now involved in flipping houses and deed theft and tenant harassment and forcing people out and trying to get new people in. But at the same time, they themselves are not bad actors. And so it becomes very complex, and what do you do? You know, and I want to go back a second to the question about deed theft and what you were asking about, Kim. If someone is tricked out of their home and they lose it pursuant to deed theft, and then the person or the entity who stole that home sells it to a third-party bona fide purchaser, the original homeowner has no recourse to get that home back. The best they can do is get money damages. And so now you have another person who's entered the picture. They've purchased that home. They're living in it. They weren't involved in the fraud, but they're kind of driving the need of why this fraudulent, this illegal activity is taking place. So it's a very complex question, and I don't know that I have an answer as to how to solve it, but it's definitely something that's problematic, because you're dealing with someone who themselves is not necessarily a bad actor, and not necessarily coming in to tear down or destroy a community, but they are having an impact on a community in a way that may not be the best in the long run.
And this question actually reminds me of the question about climate change, and I'll get there. But it's there's a push-pull, right, between people arguing that we should all take our individual responsibilities, we should not drive, we should eat less meat, we should do our part. Well, I mean, you should give up beef at least.
Sometimes.
But see, that's the tension of the debate, right? Is all of us have things we like to do, and individually, I'm not hurting anybody if I drive my car to work, right? But collectively, we do. And the solution to it always is not necessarily to appeal to some sort of like people going beyond themselves, which works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't, but it's to change the damn law. And that's, if we change the law to make it so that emitting a certain amount was illegal on a corporate level, we basically take away a lot of we make people have to change their lives as a matter of law. And so that same framework can be applied to thinking about college students, thinking about people who are maybe gentrifiers in one context or the other. If we remove the legal incentives for gentrification, that conversation becomes moot.
And Vann, I agree with that to a point, but especially as a prosecutor, people break the law every single day, and I think that's a problem you run into. And also, laws get changed back.
Yeah.
Obamacare is trying to be stripped down piece by piece, and so you see that depending on who's in political power at what particular time. So I do think it's important to focus on laws and policies and regulations, and those have a huge impact. It regulates everything as to where you can drive, how you can drive, where you can eat, where you can sleep. All of that's regulated by laws and policies that we have to live by. And it's important to focus on those and to change those. But I think the bigger aspect and the more difficult thing to do is to change people's hearts and minds. Because if you can change the hearts and minds of the public, and people collectively get to a point where they respect and, God forbid, love one another and treat each other in the way that they should be treated, then that's going to go a lot further than trying to legislate someone into good behavior. Because there's always going to be people that break the law willingly and unwillingly, but there's always going to be people who break the law. So I think the bigger problem and the deeper issue is how do you reach people's hearts and minds?
Well, I'm going to jump in, and then I'm going to go to I think, is there someone else up here? So give me 1 second, and you can ask the next one, which is I'm going to sort of put my hat on as a political scientist and say that there's this fellow named James Madison who talked about if men were angels, we wouldn't need all these things. So I think there is this tension, right, between hearts and minds versus the fact that not all hearts and minds are sort of aligned towards the good at a particular moment. And I think one of the things that I hope that we can communicate in this conversation is the fragility of African American empowerment, whether it's measured in land ownership or political rights, that does seem to be this sort of fragility, this empirical fragility to this, where there are these moments of seemingly, oh, great, and then like, oh, not so great. And that's just something I think that we are in this moment of fragility. And so how do we sort of deal with this very fragile moment in a way?
And one piece to add, I think the hearts and minds are important, obviously, because I think even if we're only talking political changes, the coalition building needed to do that, to build the political movements, to change the political will. That can only be done at the level of conversation and conversion. So, yeah.
There's a question up there. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. I'm really struck by the way the conversation, the fact that the event is framed around the question of land. We've been talking about a lot of different things, which I really appreciate. And so I was curious. I was thinking about the story about the man who dug his own pipe, like plumbed, brought city water out to his house, because that was the only way to get it. And thinking about the right to stay and the right to leave that you were talking about. And then thinking about other mechanisms and organizing today around some of these questions about something like the right to infrastructure and what, speaking sort of historically maybe or legally, or if you're aware of things, especially water systems, it's something that I happen to be like working in and knowing a little bit more about. But if we're talking about land, we're also talking about things like water. If infrastructure is a useful thing around which organizing is already happening or around which we might be organizing differently, especially vis-a-vis climate, something like a Green New Deal. I don't know, it's more of a comment, but like if we mean many things when we say land, is infrastructure a useful idea around which to organize culturally, historically, but also legally? And if that makes you think of anything that's going on that people can connect to or not?
I think it's critical. Actually, in that history, the history of homesteading, right, which is sort of the base layer that precedes this, you were granted a certain amount of land for a certain amount of money if you improve the land, which a lot of times means building out the infrastructure, building your part in helping a railroad line come and tapping the local aquifer. So that's like built into our understanding of land as a commodity generally. I think what I've seen is in terms of access to services, in terms of access to infrastructure, right to infrastructure, global communities are kind of a little more advanced than our understanding of land rights. And that's primarily a function of scarcity in lots of places. You have conversations where about water, right to pipelines, like say in the favelas in Sao Paulo that actually flow properly and not uphill. So that is a place where I think we can actually learn from our brothers and sisters across the world, from places like Cape Town, from Sao Paulo, even Moscow, which is having a big conversation over water rights, and also electricity, which is maybe the main. It's our brothers and sisters in the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, electricity, right? So I think that's actually the next kind of step here, is having that acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I'll just make one small point on that. It's I think here in the U.S., so many people take the basic infrastructure that you mentioned for granted, and it's so regulated by city, state, federal agencies and municipal regulations that I think a lot of people just, it's an afterthought to them. And if there is a major issue, it's something that's hashed out on a much larger scale. Like if you look out west, you see a lot of the states out there are constantly suing each other over water rights and access to certain rivers and electricity and things like that. So I think it plays out on a larger scale here, and it's something that I think a lot of individuals and smaller communities are more detached from.
I'll just jump in. I mean, one issue that I was hoping, but I didn't actually bring it up, is something called municipal underbounding, which is actually the literally drawing of lines. Some people are drawn in and they get city water, city electric, and others are drawn out. And so actually, particularly in the South, you have this kind of frog leaping or hopscotching of boundaries. There's a famous case of the African American community outside of the Augusta
Outside the
golf club,
Yeah.
which doesn't have any sewer systems, but literally 2 miles away from multi-million-dollar houses on the golf course. So I think, where you live does impact not only political power, but literally the ability to get services that many of us take for granted.
And we'll start thinking a lot more about broadband too.
Broadband, yeah,
which is
absolutely. Right. And so that digital divide is real. I mean, when you see young students, hanging out outside of a store because they're trying to get access to the internet to do their homework, it's 2020. Like, this is, okay, I just editorialized. Sorry. All right, do we have, how much more time do we have? A few more minutes. So maybe we'll try to collect maybe 2 questions or so. So just ask your question, then we'll just sort of do a quick answer. Did you have a question in front?
I'm saying Stacy.
It's Stacy! Yay! Hi. So, we'll actually have the questions.
Okay.
So they can ask their questions, and maybe you can and then just say whatever you want to say. Okay. So really quickly, I think there are 2 questions.
And we have one more in the back. Sorry, thank you. I'm Anina, and apropos of the bad actors in the gentrifying neighborhoods and the bad landlords doing terrible things, I volunteer in Bed-Stuy, and I'm looking around all the time to see if I can see encroaching bad things happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where I go, I don't quite see it yet. I mean, there's an Applebee's there, but I don't count that as. Anyway, the question is, thank you, I'm sorry. The question is there a way to see something like a map of emerging what's going on and the selling of property, and I'm not sure what to do with it, but at the very least to see where it is and see if there are commercial businesses at risk, and maybe, I don't know, support the good guys and boycott the bad.
Well,
We're going to take the second question. Was it here or in the back?
Okay, I just quickly, I really hate the state. I feel the state imposes so many things to the city, but you sound like a good guy.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I told you I was here in my personal capacity, so I'm not here representing the state.
But I'm just wondering, I'm just surprised how active the state is in New York properties.
All right, I'm actually going to, because we are running out of time, I just want to let Stacy.
Oh, no, I don't know what to say. Just walking in.
Right.
Hello, how is everyone?
So we asked a couple of questions about the right to stay or the right
that's
to
what we're
leave,
talking about, yeah.
and about land dispossession,
Okay.
about solutions, both short-term and long-term, and maybe if you just want to talk a little bit about your
that,
work.
Yeah. So, yes, I had a bunch of comments prepared, and those were the questions. But I will jump to the end, which is really addressing some solutions, right? So I do a lot of work on gentrification. And unfortunately, once we're at the stage of gentrification, there's little that we can do, right? Because gentrification, by definition, is about displacement and market forces. And once we've gotten there, unfortunately, it's hard to kind of mitigate at that point. So we have to be preventative. We have to do things that allow communities to have full agency and to decommodify land and take out the speculative component that makes the exchange value more valuable than the use value, right? And so those are very kind of progressive ideas, and but at the same time, there are good examples all over the country, right? Whether we're talking about community land trusts, by and large, and they're really good examples. There's some here in New York that are, I wouldn't say they're the strongest, but I would say what's happening in Boston, what's happening in Oakland, is quite strong, Oakland, Richmond, in terms of really advocating for and implementing limited liability cooperatives. So I'm a New Yorker, so I know, every building's a cooperative, but that is not like a cooperative, right? Like it's just a market rate building, right? But there are other forms of cooperatives that allow for people to live there, stay there. The land belongs to the community, and then when you decide to leave and resell that property, there's limited equity that you extract from that, and the community has the right of first refusal in terms of deciding that the community trust decides that what to do with the land and the property thereafter. And they've been successful, but you can have this really wonderful island and then have the change all around it. So it's really about bringing that into the popular discourse so that we start to value other things rather than put all of our kind of wealth and hope in property, and really look at housing as a right. If we understood housing as a right, we would think about policies differently. But I don't want to take up too much.
One more question. Let's do one more question and maybe just that.
My question is about eminent domain and how does that play into it? And I'm kind of reminded, I'm going back into the 19th century. I've done some research on the community of Seneca Village and the whole Central Park situation, and having people displaced and removed to make Central Park, which was for the greater good, but then where did these people go? They couldn't afford to go places. They're scattered all about. Communities are just kind of lost and perhaps end up in some kind of a redlined community, but then it comes to, it catches up with them again when they move to another space. And so in this day and age, what are we doing? The rules of redlining are changing. We're supposed to be talking about this idea of redlining and beyond, and the city is very popular. Everybody wants to move back and live in the city, so where are the people going? They're getting thrown out to the island into spaces where infrastructure is falling apart, or it's just difficult for people to pay those tickets to get on the railroad, to come back and forth to do the work. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of comment about that and this idea of eminent domain and the role that plays.
Okay, so how about if we start with Vann, and we'll go, and I think we're going to kind of wrap up. Becky's nodding.
Okay, yeah, let's. I'll be quick. I think you mentioned something that I'm really focused on, which is all the different mechanisms that move people. So obviously one of the main factors if in your future displacement is your past displacement. And I think what this conversation actually shows us is that we should think about the right to stay as a right to move, and think about the end result of the policies rather than thinking about rather than building around the mechanisms themselves. So lots of people think about, lots of people have heard the term redlining and they want to legislate redlining, which is a good thing, right? But then, as the history of housing policy in America has shown, we can legislate one thing and then we can push people out with the next mechanism. We can reverse redlining is a big deal in Baltimore now. We can use predatory loan practices and stuff we talked about today to move people out. So I think restructuring this conversation to think about the end result, which is displacement, which is the violation of the right to stay and to move, is where we should move forward.
I think what you raised just brings it down to the idea of absolute freedom of choice, whether it's eminent domain or it's economic pressures that are squeezing someone out of a neighborhood that they've been in for a long time. You're taking away that absolute freedom of choice. You're causing them to leave a community when they necessarily didn't want to. So how do we get to a place where the highest number of people in the society have that freedom of choice, where they're able to make a determination where they want to live and how they want to live there? And if we can find a way to get there, I think we'll be doing very well.
Yeah. I would just say that in terms of, I think there are very different mechanisms that you're talking about in terms of eminent domain and the state's right to take land from the private use to put it into a kind of a public use. And you named some historical moments where that's happened. That is not the primary way in which we're seeing gentrification or displacement, although it is something that gets used fairly regularly, right? But the issue of kind of the right to remain. And also, you mentioned redlining, and that's what this is about. And so, one of the things I wanted to mention with my remarks is that redlining is, it has a specific historical context, and we use the term broadly to talk about a lot of different forms of predation, right? And each one is unique, but each one they're kind of interrelated at the same time, and the outcome is the same. Right, the outcome is that black and brown marginalized bodies are displaced or experience a sense of dispossession, and they're further marginalized, where the powerful get to make the decisions. And if I decide I'm kind of thirsty, I want that, right? And it's essentially that, right? I'm simplifying it, but I'm saying you have this beverage, you want the beverage, but I have more money. And I want that beverage. So, then there becomes a struggle, but you'll lose because I have more power. I know that's a simplification, but redlining was one of those moments. In the 1930s, it was, the 1968, it was, as Brother said, it was, the legislation said that it's illegal, but we see different forms of that today. And I also think it's important to go before redlining, right, and to pay homage to the indigenous people, the land in which we're sitting, and the various legal structural forms of violence that were used to take the land from them. And it's a continuous process. And so where we are today in terms of talking about predatory lending and gentrification, and and prior to that was redlining. There's a lot of nomenclature, a lot of terms that we use, but at the end of the day, we produce a lot of the same things. And so the only kind of redress that I see is about organizing. It's about really trying to determine, collectively we have more power. Well, I might want that and I have a lot of money, but collectively I can't do. If everyone is standing with you, I'm not going to be able to get that drink. Probably not, right? So that to me, as an urban planner, as just a New Yorker, as someone that thinks a lot about this, I've really moved toward kind of the movement work and the organizing and the collective possibilities.
Great. Well, I think that leaves us off on a slightly hopeful note. Organize for the right for us to survive and thrive in the places that we want to be in. So I'd like to thank you all. This has been really great. Amazing experience to have this conversation.